The air in Mr. Albright's office was thick with the scent of old paper and leather, a smell Sophia had always associated with finality. It had only been 3 days since the funeral, and the grief was still a raw, hollow space in her chest. George, her stepfather for over 20 years, was gone. He had been a quiet pillar in her life, not a man of grand gestures or easy affection, but of steadfast presence. He had loved her mother fiercely, and for that, Sophia had always been grateful. She sat opposite the lawyer, a man with kind eyes and a face etched with the solemnity of his profession. He had just finished reading the will, a simple document leaving the house and his modest savings to her mother, and a small specific sum to Sophia herself. It was what she had expected. George was a carpenter, a man who worked with his hands. His life was one of sawdust, sweat, and simple comforts. There were no hidden fortunes to be found. Or so she thought. Mr. Albright cleared his throat, setting the papers down on his polished mahogany desk. He leaned forward, his gaze gentle but piercing. "Sophia," he began, his voice low, "there's something else. A matter not detailed in the will." She waited, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Your stepfather was a very particular man," Mr. Albright continued, choosing his words carefully. "He managed his finances with meticulous care. The money he earned from his carpentry work, the income from a few small investments his father left him, it all went directly into a joint account with your mother, for household expenses, for your education, for everything." Sophia nodded. "He was a good man. He took care of us." "He did," the lawyer agreed. "But there was another account, a significant one, an inheritance he received from his side of the family years ago, even before he met your mother. It has been sitting there, untouched, for decades." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the quiet room. "Did you ever wonder why he never touched his own money?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unexpected. Sophia stared at him, her mind racing. "His own money? I don't understand. I assumed everything he had was ours." She thought of George's calloused hands, the worn-out flannel shirts he always wore, the old truck he drove until it sputtered its last breath. The image of him having a separate, untouched fortune felt alien, impossible. Why would a man of such simple habits, who patched his own boots and fixed every leaky faucet himself, hoard a secret inheritance? "He never told my mother?" Sophia asked, a knot tightening in her stomach. "No one," Mr. Albright confirmed. "He lived off his labor, and a very small pension. The inheritance, he treated it as if it didn't exist. It just sat there, growing." A strange mix of emotions washed over Sophia. Confusion, a flicker of resentment, and a deep, aching curiosity. It was as if the man she had known for 2 decades was suddenly a stranger. His quietness, which she had always interpreted as simple stoicism, now seemed like a fortress built around a secret. What was he hiding? Or what was he saving? Mr. Albright seemed to read her thoughts. He reached into a desk drawer and pulled out an old, ornate skeleton key, its metal tarnished with age. It wasn't a house key or a car key, it was something from a different era. He slid it across the desk toward her. "He left this for you, Sophia," the lawyer said. "It was in a separate envelope with your name on it, along with a single instruction." He took a deep breath. He said, "Give this to Sophia. She'll know what it opens." Sophia picked up the key. It felt heavy in her palm, cold and solid. She stared at it, her mind a blank. She had no idea what it could possibly open. She had never seen it before in her life. The man of simple habits had left her with a complex mystery. The silent pillar of her life had just spoken his loudest words, and they were a riddle. The drive home was a blur. Sophia held the old key in her hand, its jagged edges pressing into her palm. The weight of it felt less like metal, and more like the physical manifestation of a question. Why, George? Why the secret? Her mind kept replaying Mr. Albright's words. He never touched his own money. It felt like a betrayal, but a strange one. A betrayal not of malice, but of inexplicable sacrifice. What could possibly have motivated him to live a life of such frugality when he had the means for so much more? When she arrived home, the house was silent. Her mother was resting, the emotional exhaustion of the past week having finally caught up with her. Sophia was glad for the solitude. She couldn't face her mother yet, not with this new, unsettling secret lodged in her heart. To tell her that George had hidden a fortune from them both felt cruel, like tarnishing the memory of a man her mother had unequivocally adored. First, she had to understand. She'll know what it opens. George's posthumous message echoed in her head. Sophia walked through the house, her eyes scanning every piece of furniture, every old box, every locked door. Nothing seemed right. The key was old world, intricate. It belonged to something with history, something made of wood and time. And then it hit her. Of course, it wasn't in the house. It was in his workshop. The workshop at the back of the garden had always been George's sanctuary. As a child, she had loved the smell of it, a rich, earthy perfume of sawdust, wood varnish, and metal. Peeking through the dusty windows, she would watch him work for hours, his movements precise and patient, his focus absolute. He wasn't a talkative man, but in his workshop, surrounded by his tools and his projects, he seemed to communicate everything that mattered: diligence, integrity, and a quiet passion for creation. She slid the heavy wooden door open, and the familiar scent washed over her, so potent that it was almost like he was still there. Sunlight streamed through a grimy pane of glass, illuminating dancing dust motes. His tools hung in their designated places on the wall, a neat and orderly army of saws, chisels, and hammers. His workbench was tidy, a half-finished birdhouse sitting on it, a silent testament to a life interrupted. Her heart ached. This was the George she knew. Simple, grounded. So where did a secret fortune and a mysterious key fit in? She began to search. She opened drawers filled with screws and nails sorted by size. She peered into old paint cans and behind stacks of lumber. She ran her hands along the shelves he had built, feeling for a hidden latch or a loose board. Nothing. The workshop was exactly what it appeared to be, the workspace of an honest carpenter. Frustration began to set in. Was this a wild goose chase? A cruel joke? She slumped onto a wooden stool, her gaze sweeping across the room one more time. And that's when she saw it. Tucked away in the darkest corner, underneath a heavy, grease-stained canvas tarp, was a shape she didn't recognize. It was a large, rectangular form, completely obscured. It had been there for as long as she could remember, a silent fixture in the background of her childhood memories, so constant that it had become invisible. With a surge of adrenaline, Sophia crossed the room and pulled the heavy tarp away. A cloud of dust billowed up, making her cough. As it settled, her breath caught in her throat. It was a chest, but it was unlike any toolbox she had ever seen. It was a masterpiece. Made of a deep, rich mahogany, it was adorned with intricate carvings of leaves and vines. The joinery was seamless, the finish so smooth it looked like liquid under the faint light. This wasn't a functional object. It was a work of art. It was the kind of piece a craftsman might make once in a lifetime, to prove to himself the peak of his skill. And on the front, nestled amongst the carvings, was a small, ornate lock, its metal dark with age, a perfect match for the key in her hand. Her fingers trembled as she inserted the key into the lock. It slid in with a satisfying smoothness. She took a deep breath, held it, and turned. A solid, definitive click echoed in the silent workshop. For a moment, she just stared at it, her heart pounding against her ribs. This was it, the answer. With a sense of both dread and desperate hope, Sophia lifted the heavy lid. Sophia expected to see stacks of cash, stock certificates, or gold bars. She braced herself for the vulgarity of a hidden fortune, a sight that would shatter the humble image of the man who had raised her. But the inside of the chest held no money. It held a life. The scent that rose from the open chest was of cedar and thyme. The top layer was filled with journals, dozens of them, bound in worn black leather. They were stacked neatly, organized by year. Beneath them, carefully wrapped in yellowing tissue paper, were photographs, stacks of them, held together by faded ribbons. And tucked into the corners were small personal effects: a tarnished silver locket, a pair of worn baby shoes, and a single pressed white rose, its petals as delicate as onion skin. This wasn't a vault. It was a shrine, a place where memories were kept safe, locked away from the world. Sophia's hands, which had been trembling, steadied. The resentment she had felt began to dissolve, replaced by a profound and overwhelming sense of sorrow. This was not the secret of a miser. This was the secret of a man with a past he could not bear to part with, but could not bear to look at either. She picked up the first bundle of photographs, untying the faded blue ribbon. The picture on top was of George, but a George she had never seen. He was young, perhaps in his early 20s, with a broad, easy smile that reached his eyes. In her memories, George's smiles were rare and subdued, small acknowledgments of a joke or a pleasant moment. This man in the photograph laughed openly, his head thrown back, his eyes alight with a joy that seemed boundless. He was standing next to a young woman with a cascade of dark hair and a smile that mirrored his own. She was beautiful, and the way they looked at each other spoke of a deep and uncomplicated love. Sophia's heart constricted. This was not her mother. She flipped through the other photos. They showed the same couple, their life unfolding in black and white and faded color. Picnics in sun-drenched parks, laughing on a beach, posing proudly in front of a small, charming house with a white picket fence. In one, the woman was holding a newborn baby, her face glowing with maternal love, while George looked on, his expression one of awe and adoration. A family. He had a family before them. The knot in her stomach returned, tighter than ever. Why had he never spoken of them? What had happened to this woman and this child? Her mind, which had been bracing for a story of greed, was now faced with a story of immense loss. This secret was not about money at all. The money Mr. Albright had spoken of, the untouched inheritance. It suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. It was a ghost, a relic from a life he had been forced to leave behind. With a heavy heart, she turned her attention to the journals. She picked up the one from the earliest year. The handwriting was neat, the loops and curves precise, just like his work with wood. The first few pages were filled with the mundane details of a young man's life. Notes about his carpentry apprenticeship, complaints about his boss, dreams of starting his own business. And then a name appeared. Eliza. Met Eliza today, he wrote. She laughed at a joke I made, and I think I forgot my own name. Her eyes are the color of the sky just before the sun sets. Sophia read on, her own life fading into the background as she was pulled into the pages of George's past. She read about their courtship, their marriage, the joy he felt when he bought their first home. He wrote about building their furniture with his own hands, pouring all his love and skill into a cradle for their unborn child. He named the baby Lily. The entries were filled with a poetic tenderness she would never have associated with the quiet, stoic George she knew. He was a man deeply in love, a man who found poetry in the grain of a piece of wood and the color of his wife's eyes. She read for what felt like hours, the sun beginning to set outside the workshop window, casting long shadows across the room. She followed the story of their life, their happiness so palpable it made her own heart ache. Then she came to the journal that was dated 2 years after Lily's birth. The entries grew shorter, more sporadic. The joyful tone was gone, replaced by an undercurrent of anxiety. Eliza's cough is worse, one entry read. The doctor says it's just a lingering cold, but she's so tired. And Lily, she has it too. Sophia's blood ran cold. She flipped ahead a few pages, her fingers clumsy. The entries became frantic, filled with doctors' names, medications, and desperate pleading prayers. The last entry in the journal was a single, blotchy, almost illegible sentence. The house is silent. They're both gone. And the money from my father, the money I was saving for their future, for Lily's education, it is a curse. It is the price of everything I have lost. Sophia closed the journal, her fingers tracing the tear-stained words. The silence in the workshop was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a living entity, filled with the echoes of a grief so profound it had been locked away for decades. The man she knew, the quiet, reserved George, was not the man he was supposed to be. He was a survivor, the sole remnant of a shipwrecked life. She finally understood. The money, the inheritance he never touched, wasn't hoarded out of greed. It was a memorial, a painful, constant reminder of the future he had planned for Eliza and Lily, a future that had been stolen from him. Spending it would have felt like a betrayal, like admitting that their dreams could be repurposed. To him, that money was stained with loss, forever tied to the life he couldn't save. It wasn't an asset. It was an anchor, holding him to the moment his world went silent. Her mind reeled, reframing every memory she had of him. His quietness wasn't aloofness. It was the careful quiet of a man walking through a life that felt like a library of sleeping sorrows, afraid to make a sound lest he wake the ghosts. His frugality wasn't stinginess. It was the habit of a man who had learned that life's most precious things, a wife's laugh, a daughter's touch, had no price, and that all the money in the world was meaningless without them. He had poured his life into his work, into the joint account he shared with her mother, because that was real, that was tangible. That was the life he was living now. The money he earned with his own hands was the only money that felt clean, untainted by tragedy. It was the money he used to build a second life, a second chance at a family. Sophia thought of her mother, of the gentle, steady love George had always shown her. It wasn't the fiery, poetic passion he had written about with Eliza. It couldn't have been. It was a different kind of love, quieter, more cautious, but just as deep. It was the love of a man who knew the fragility of happiness and cherished it with a fierce, protective tenderness. He hadn't just married her mother. He had chosen to build a new life from the wreckage of his old one, a testament to his resilience, not his forgetfulness. He had given them everything he had to give, everything that wasn't locked away in that chest. She looked around the workshop, seeing it now not as a place of work, but as a place of therapy. Every piece of wood he shaped, every joint he perfected, was a small act of creation in the face of devastating loss. It was how he processed his grief, how he made sense of a world that had taken everything from him. He didn't talk about his pain, he built over it, creating new things, useful things, beautiful things. Her gaze fell upon the half-finished birdhouse on the workbench. She picked it up. The tiny pieces of wood were perfectly cut, the edges sanded smooth. It was a simple project, yet it was made with the same care and precision as the magnificent chest. He wasn't building it for any grand purpose. He was building it because that's what he did. He built. He had built a life for Eliza and Lily. When that was destroyed, he had built a life for Sophia and her mother. He had spent his years building a wall of normalcy and safety around them, and the foundation of that wall was his own silent, secret sorrow. Tears welled in Sophia's eyes, but they were not tears of confusion or resentment. They were tears of understanding, of a deep and painful empathy for the quiet man she had only thought she knew. He had never burdened them with his past. He had carried it alone in this dusty workshop, in the pages of these journals, inside a chest he had built to hold the pieces of his broken heart. The instruction he left for Mr. Albright suddenly became clear. Give this to Sophia. She'll know what it opens. He wasn't just giving her the key to a physical lock. He was trusting her with the key to his life, to his story. He was trusting her to understand the man he had been, so she could finally understand the man he had become. He knew she was the only one who could bridge the two worlds. Sophia carefully placed the journal back in the chest, alongside the photographs and the pressed rose. For now, this secret would remain here, but it could not stay locked away forever. Her mother deserved to know the truth, not the painful details perhaps, but the truth of George's sacrifice. She deserved to know the full depth of the man she had loved. With newfound resolve, Sophia closed the heavy lid. The soft click of the lock felt different this time. It was not an act of concealment, but one of reverence. She draped the canvas tarp back over the chest, her movements slow and deliberate. She left the workshop, pulling the heavy door shut, and walked back toward the house. The weight of George's story no longer a burden, but a legacy she now carried for him. Sophia stepped back into the quiet house, her world tilted on its axis. The familiar rooms looked the same, but she saw them through different eyes. She saw the sturdy bookshelf George had built in the living room, the smoothly repaired leg on the antique dining table, the perfectly hung pictures on the walls. They were no longer just household objects. They were the brushstrokes of a man painting a new life over the canvas of an old one. They were acts of love, painstakingly rendered. Her mother, Helen, was in the armchair, a photo album open on her lap. She looked up as Sophia entered, her eyes puffy from a day of quiet weeping. "There you are," she said, her voice soft. "I was just looking at this picture from our wedding. He looks so serious." Sophia walked over and looked at the photograph. George stood beside her mother, handsome in his rented tuxedo, but his smile was small, his eyes holding a familiar, distant reserve. Before today, Sophia would have seen it as simple awkwardness. Now, she saw the ghost of a man standing at an altar for the second time, praying that this happiness would be allowed to last. "Mom," Sophia said, sitting on the ottoman at her mother's feet, "we need to talk about George. There are things I've learned, things he wanted me to know." Helen closed the album, her attention fully on her daughter. "What is it, sweetheart? Did Mr. Albright have more news?" Sophia took a deep breath, choosing her words with the same care George might have used when selecting a piece of wood. She didn't want to shatter her mother's heart, only to deepen her understanding of it. She didn't mention the journals or the chest in the workshop. The raw grief in those pages was George's alone. Instead, she shared the story. "George, he had a life before us, Mom. A long time ago." She spoke softly, telling her about a beautiful young woman named Eliza and a little girl named Lily. She described the profound love George had for them, a love so deep he had chronicled it, and the unimaginable tragedy that had taken them both from him far too soon. As she spoke, Helen's face transformed. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of jealousy or betrayal. They were tears of pure, unadulterated empathy. She placed a hand over her mouth, a soft sob escaping. "Oh, my George," she whispered. He carried that all by himself, all these years. Suddenly, it all made sense to her, too. His nightmares, Helen said, her voice trembling. Sometimes he would wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat. He would never talk about it. He would just hold my hand until he fell asleep again. And his silences, I always thought it was just his way. But he was remembering. He was, Sophia affirmed gently. He wasn't hiding it from you, Mom. I think he was protecting you from it. And protecting himself. He loved you so much. He built this life with you piece by piece. Helen looked around the room, her gaze lingering on the evidence of George's handiwork. He did, didn't he? She said, a sad, loving smile touching her lips. He made this our home. He made it safe. Then Sophia told her about the money, the untouched inheritance, the fortune that sat in an account, a silent monument to a future that never was. Helen listened, her expression shifting from sorrow to astonishment, and finally to a quiet understanding. So that's why, she said. That's why he was so careful. That money, it wasn't his. Not really. It belonged to them. It belonged to a dream he had for them, Sophia said. And I don't think he could ever bear to spend it on anything else. They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of George's secret finally shared, lifting from the shadows and settling into a place of mutual reverence. The man they were grieving was no longer just a quiet carpenter and a devoted husband. He was a figure of quiet heroism, a man who had lost everything and still found the strength to love again, to build again. So what do we do with it? Helen finally asked, her voice clear and resolved. With the money. Sophia knew the answer was already in her mother's heart, just as it was in hers. We give it the purpose he never could, she said. We use it to honor them, all of them, Eliza, Lily, and the George who loved them. In the weeks that followed, that's exactly what they did. They established the Eliza and Lily's Promise, a charitable foundation funded by the entirety of George's untouched inheritance. They created scholarships for young, aspiring woodworkers and carpenters who lacked the funds to pursue their craft, ensuring George's passion for building would be passed on. They also made a significant donation to the local children's hospital, funding a new wing for pediatric care. The money, which had been a symbol of death and loss for George, became a source of life and hope for others. It was no longer a curse. It was a blessing. Sophia never went back to the workshop to read the journals again. She didn't need to. George's true legacy wasn't in the chest he had built to contain his past. It was in the quiet strength he had modeled every day. It was in the lesson he had unknowingly taught her, that the deepest sorrows can coexist with the most steadfast love, and that a life is not measured by what is lost, but by what is built from the pieces that remain. He had left her not a fortune, but a story, and the understanding that the most valuable inheritance is a map of the human heart.